In the summer of 1937, a man pried open the back of a rotting piano, and something inside moved. Not a rat, not loose wood, something deliberate. His name was Elias Carter, a quiet restorer who had spent years bringing forgotten instruments back to life. He believed every piano carried memory in its wood, echoes of the hands that played it. But this one felt wrong before he even touched it. The piano came from a collapsed plantation house in rural Louisiana. No family name remained attached to it, no ownership records, just a tag tied to one broken key. Do not play after sundown. Elias laughed when he first saw it. By the third night, he wasn't laughing anymore. He reported in a letter never sent that the piano did not stay silent. Even untouched, certain keys would press down slowly, as if fingers unseen were remembering something they refused to forget. And then, on the fourth day, he removed the back panel. What he found inside was not part of any instrument ever made, and it was not meant to be found. The plantation where the piano was found no longer appears on official maps. Locals in Iberville Parish referred to it only as the house without a name. It stood far beyond the main road, surrounded by cypress trees that grew unnaturally close together, blocking out most of the light even at noon. According to scattered land records from the early 1800s, the property once belonged to a man named Reverend Josiah Bellamy, a preacher who arrived in Louisiana under unclear circumstances. He did not build a church. Instead, he built the house. And inside that house, witnesses claimed he held services that were never recorded in any parish archive. Former workers, those who survived long enough to leave, spoke of music echoing through the halls late at night. Not hymns, not melodies anyone recognized. Something slower, repetitive, like a ritual disguised as sound. The piano was delivered to the house in 1823. It was custom-made. There is no record of who built it, but there is a receipt, signed only with a symbol that does not belong to any known craftsman or company. After the piano arrived, something in the house changed. People stopped leaving. Between 1825 and 1838, Reverend Bellamy officially adopted 11 children. No birth records, no origins, no inquiries. Each child was given a new name and was never seen outside the plantation grounds again. Neighbors reported seeing them only once, standing in the upper windows, perfectly still, watching the road in complete silence. There are no photographs, but one written account remains from a traveling doctor who was invited into the house in 1831. He described the children as healthy but deeply withdrawn, as though listening to something beneath the air itself. He also noted something unusual. None of the children spoke, not a single word. Yet, according to the doctor, they communicated perfectly with Bellamy in evening gatherings centered around the piano. He wrote, "The instrument appears to guide them. Their eyes follow the sound before it is made, as if they already know what will be played." Weeks later, the doctor attempted to report his concerns. He never reached town. His carriage was found abandoned near the swamp, the horses still harnessed, trembling, refusing to move forward. Inside the carriage, investigators found a single sheet of paper, covered with repeated handwriting. "It is not music." The last confirmed activity at the plantation occurred in the winter of 1842. On December 14th, several nearby residents reported hearing the piano continuously from dusk until sunrise. No breaks, no pauses, just a single evolving sequence of notes that seemed to grow more frantic as the night went on. One witness claimed the sound carried through the trees like a voice trying to speak through water. At dawn, the music stopped completely. When authorities finally entered the house 2 days later, they found no signs of struggle, no blood, no damage, just absence. Bellamy was gone. All 11 children were gone. The house itself appeared abandoned mid-moment. Chairs slightly pulled back, candles burned down to nothing. And the piano was still warm. Investigators noted something deeply unsettling. Several of the keys were pressed down, not fully, but just enough to suggest they had been held recently, as if someone or something had been playing it until the very last second. The instrument was removed weeks later. No one wanted to keep it. No one wanted to touch it. So it was stored, moved, forgotten, until nearly a century later, Elias Carter opened it, and whatever had been sealed inside was still there.
When Elias Carter removed the back panel of the piano, he expected dust, warped wood, maybe a dead animal. Instead, he found a compartment, not part of the original design. It had been carved in afterward, precisely, carefully, hidden behind the internal frame where no casual repair would ever reach. Inside it was a bundle, wrapped in cloth that had long since darkened with age, stiff as if soaked and dried over and over again. Elias hesitated before touching it. He would later write that the air inside the piano smelled different from the room, thicker, almost sweet, like something preserved far too long. When he finally unwrapped the bundle, he did not understand what he was looking at first. It looked like strips of old parchment, thin, pale, fragile. But the texture was wrong, too soft in some places, too rigid in others. And then he noticed the stitching, fine thread, blackened with time, running through the edges, binding the pieces together into something that resembled pages. A book, but not made of paper. Elias closed it immediately. He did not want to know. But something about the piano had already begun to change him, because within minutes, he opened it again. The pages were filled with markings, but no ink had been used. The symbols appeared pressed into the surface itself, as if written by force rather than by hand. Deep grooves, careful lines, repeating patterns. Not a language Elias recognized. Not Latin, not French, not anything he had seen in hymnals or restoration notes. And yet, he understood it. Not clearly, not logically. But the longer he stared, the more the shapes seemed to rearrange themselves into meaning, not through reading, but through feeling. Like remembering something he had never learned. He described a growing pressure behind his eyes, accompanied by a strange certainty. This was not meant to be read. It was meant to be played. At the bottom of several pages were sequences, patterns aligned in a way that mirrored piano keys. Not music in the traditional sense, but instructions. Elias tried to resist. He closed the book, stepped away, covered the piano. But that night, as he lay in bed, he could hear it. Not actual sound, but the idea of sound. Notes forming in his mind, pressing forward, insisting on completion. By morning, he returned to the workshop, and without fully deciding to, he sat down at the piano. Elias placed his fingers on the keys with hesitation. The room felt smaller than it had before, quieter, like something was waiting. He followed the first sequence from memory. Not perfectly, but close enough. The notes came out uneven, soft, then sharp, then unnaturally prolonged, as though the strings inside resisted being struck. Halfway through, his hands began to shake. Not from fear, from resistance. It felt as if his body did not want to continue, but something deeper, something beneath thought, pushed him forward. When he reached the final note, the effect was immediate. The temperature in the room dropped. Not gradually, all at once. Elias described seeing his own breath in the air as he pulled his hands away from the keys. Then, for a moment, nothing. Silence so complete it felt unnatural. And then, a sound. Not from the piano, from inside it. A slow, deliberate shifting, like something adjusting its position after being still for a very long time. Elias did not open the piano again that day, but he did not leave the workshop either, because somewhere in the back of his mind, another sequence was already forming. Over the next 3 days, Elias changed. Neighbors later reported that his workshop light stayed on through the night, long after he had finished any known project. He stopped answering the door, stopped speaking to anyone who called his name. And the piano, it began to sound on its own. At first it was subtle, a single note late at night, then two, then full, broken patterns, imperfect versions of the sequences from the book, as if something inside the instrument was learning. Elias began documenting his experiences in a journal. The entries became increasingly fragmented, shorter, more urgent. He wrote about dreams where he stood inside the old plantation house, watching the children as they faced the piano in silence. He wrote that they were not afraid, that they were waiting. And most disturbingly, he wrote that he no longer believed the piano was an object, but a container, not holding something physical, but something that had been given shape through sound. On the final page of the journal, Elias wrote a single line. It remembers them. Below it, a sequence of notes, longer than any before, more complex, and, according to later analysis, impossible for one person to play alone.
Elias did not remember writing the final sequence. That realization came slowly. At first, he believed the gaps in his memory were due to exhaustion. Too many nights without sleep, too many hours staring at something his mind could not fully process. But the evidence in front of him told a different story. The sequence written in his journal, long, complex, layered, required more than 2 hands. That alone should have been enough to stop him. It wasn't. Because when Elias placed his fingers on the keys again, something strange happened. He did not feel alone. There was no visible presence, no shadow moving across the room, but his hands did not move entirely on their own. Certain notes, far from his reach, pressed down at the exact moment they were needed. Perfectly timed, perfectly controlled. As if someone else was sitting beside him. Or worse, as if someone else was using him. Elias tried to pull away, but the sequence continued. Faster now, more precise. The sound filling the room wasn't chaotic anymore. It was structured, intentional. And beneath it, faintly, there were other sounds. Breathing. Not his own. Records recovered decades later would suggest that Reverend Bellamy was not simply a preacher. He was a man obsessed with the idea that sound could shape reality. Not metaphorically, literally. Fragments of his writings, hidden in church archives under unrelated documents, describe something he called the echo beneath creation. He believed that all things, people, places, thoughts, carried a resonance, a frequency that could be altered, controlled, or erased. But Bellamy did not think this power came from God. He believed it came from something older, something that existed before language, before memory. The piano, according to these writings, was not built to create music. It was built to translate, to turn human action, keystrokes, into something that could be understood by whatever existed beyond that echo. The children, They were not adopted out of kindness. They were chosen, selected for their silence, for their ability to listen without questioning. Bellamy trained them not to speak, but to respond, not with words, but with perfect, synchronized movement. He was not teaching them music, he was teaching them how to become part of it. Elias began seeing them more clearly, not just in dreams, in reflections, in the corners of the room where light didn't fully reach. At first, it was just one child, standing still, watching, then another, then all 11. They did not move unless he played. And when he did, they changed. Their posture would shift slightly with each note, their heads tilting in unnatural synchronization, their attention locked not on Elias, but on the piano itself, as if they were still following instructions, still waiting to complete something. Elias tried to stop playing, more than once, but the silence became unbearable. Not quiet, not peaceful, but heavy, like pressure building inside his skull. The only relief came when he returned to the keys, when the sequences continued, when the presence in the room felt satisfied. His journal entries became almost unreadable at this point, lines overlapping, words repeated. But one passage stands out. They are not trapped here. They are unfinished. On the 7th night after opening the piano, Elias locked himself inside the workshop. No one saw him enter, but several people later reported hearing the instrument begin just after sunset. This time, there were no mistakes, no hesitation. The music, if it could still be called that, was fluid, layered, impossible. Witnesses described the sound as too full for a single instrument, as if multiple pianos were playing at once, slightly out of sync, creating a depth that made it difficult to focus. Inside the workshop, Elias sat rigid at the bench. His hands moved, but not freely. His posture remained fixed. And behind him, though no one was there, the air itself seemed to shift with each note. As the sequence approached its end, something changed. The temperature did not drop this time. It rose. The room grew warmer, then hotter. The wood of the piano began to creak under pressure that had no visible source. And then, at the final note, Elias stopped breathing. Not slowly, not gradually, instantly. His body remained upright for several seconds afterward, hands still resting on the keys, eyes open, unblinking. And then, from inside the piano, came a sound no one could later describe clearly, not because it was quiet, but because it was too complex to remember. A sound layered with something that resembled voices. By morning, the workshop door was still locked from the inside. No one had seen Elias leave. Concern turned into action when the silence stretched too long. A neighbor forced the door open just after sunrise. What they found inside didn't make sense. Elias was still seated at the piano, exactly where he had been the night before. But something was wrong. His posture was too straight, too fixed, like his body had settled into place rather than relaxed into it. His hands rested gently on the keys, and his face, there was no fear, no pain, just a strange, empty calm, as if whatever had been inside him had stepped away without resistance. They called for help immediately, but before anyone could move him, one of the men in the room noticed something small. A single key on the piano slowly pressed down. No one was touching it. No one was near it. The room fell silent, and then another key moved. Elias Carter was declared dead before noon. Cause of death? Unknown. There were no marks on his body, no signs of struggle, nothing to explain how a healthy man could simply stop in an instant. But the investigation didn't end there, because the piano, it could not be ignored anymore. Several men attempted to move it out of the workshop. Each of them later gave similar statements. They described a feeling, not pain, not fear, but resistance, as if the instrument did not want to be moved, as if it had become part of the room itself. It took 6 men to lift it, and even then they claimed it felt heavier than it should have been, not physically, but in a way none of them could properly explain. When they finally opened the back panel, the hidden compartment was empty. The book Elias had found was gone. No torn cloth, no fragments, no trace that anything had ever been there at all. But something else had changed. The inside of the piano, the wood, the strings, the frame, were covered in fine markings, not carved, not scratched, but pressed, like impressions left behind by something soft and deliberate. And they weren't random, they followed patterns, sequences. The decision was made quickly. The piano would be destroyed. No museum, no storage, no further study. Whatever had happened in that workshop was enough. They moved the instrument to an open field outside town, prepared tools, fuel, fire. Simple solutions for something they did not understand. But the moment they tried to break it, things went wrong. The first strike, an axe against the side, did nothing. Not because the wood was too strong, but because the man swinging it stopped mid-motion. He later claimed he heard something. Not a voice, but a recognition. Like hearing your own name spoken in a crowded place. He dropped the axe, refused to continue. Another man stepped forward, then another. Each attempt ended the same way. Hesitation, confusion, withdrawal. Finally, in frustration, they poured fuel over the piano and set it alight. The fire caught quickly, but it didn't behave normally. The flames burned low, controlled, almost contained to the surface, as if something beneath refused to let the heat reach deeper. And then the sound began. Not loud, not sudden, but unmistakable. A single note, playing from inside the instrument burning. What happened next was never meant to be preserved, but somehow a fragment survived. One of the men present that day had brought a portable recording device, primitive, limited, but functional. He had intended to document the destruction. Instead, he captured something else. The recording begins with fire crackling, low voices in the background. Then, silence. Then, the note, followed by another, then several forming a broken pattern. Unsteady at first, then stabilizing, becoming structured, recognizable. The same sequence Elias had written in his journal, the same sequence that required more than 2 hands. As the recording continues, something else becomes clear. There are breaths, multiple, soft, out of sync, layered beneath the sound of the piano. And just before the recording cuts off, there is a moment, a brief shift, where the notes stop, and something else takes their place. Not music, not noise, but something disturbingly close to speech. The recording was never officially logged. It didn't enter evidence. It didn't appear in any report. Instead, it passed quietly, hand to hand, between people who didn't fully understand what they were hearing, but couldn't ignore it either. Years later, a linguist, someone who specialized in ancient and dead languages, was asked to analyze a copy. Not for translation, just for structure. He listened to the recording multiple times, slowed it down, isolated the layered sounds beneath the piano. And then he stopped, because what he found wasn't a language, at least not one spoken in the usual sense. The patterns in the recording didn't behave like words. They behaved like responses, call and answer, input and return. As if the piano wasn't producing sound, it was participating in something. The notes were not the message, they were the question, and whatever existed beneath them was answering back. Reconstructing the final night at the plantation required piecing together fragments, Bellamy's writings, witness accounts, and what little could be inferred from Elias's journal. But a picture began to form. Bellamy had not been trying to summon something, he had been trying to complete something. The children were not victims in the way people assumed. They were participants, trained, prepared, aligned. The sequences played on the piano weren't random. They were steps, stages in a process designed to reach a very specific point, a moment of synchronization. On that final night in 1842, Bellamy and the 11 children played together, not as individuals, but as a system. Multiple sets of hands, multiple inputs, all following the same sequence, and at the final note, they didn't disappear. They transitioned. Not physically, but structurally. Whatever the piano was built to do, it worked. But it didn't take them away. It changed what they were. The reason the piano resisted destruction was never fully explained, but one theory continues to surface. If Bellamy was correct, if sound could shape reality, then the piano wasn't just an object anymore. It was a fixed point, a place where something had already crossed over. Destroying it wouldn't undo what had happened. It would only disturb it. And the fire? The fire didn't fail, it just didn't matter. Because whatever had been placed inside the piano was no longer inside in a physical sense. It had spread into the structure, into the patterns carved into the wood, into the sequences themselves. Which meant, as long as the sequence could be played, the connection remained. The final piece of this story was discovered decades later, not in the workshop, not at the plantation, but in a private collection mislabeled among unrelated documents. It was a single page, handwritten, unsigned, but the writing matched Elias Carter's journal. The page contained no explanation, no context, just a short message, and beneath it, a sequence. The message read, "It is not contained. It is waiting." Below it, the same impossible pattern of notes, unchanged, unfinished, and at the very bottom of the page, a detail most people overlook. A second set of markings, fainter, less precise, but clearly added after the original. As if someone else, or something else, had tried to continue the sequence, and didn't quite succeed. Some believe the piano was destroyed, others insist it was moved, hidden, forgotten again. But every few years in different places, under different circumstances, the same reports surface. An old instrument, no clear origin, a strange sequence of notes, and the feeling that something is listening, waiting for someone to finish what was started.